Oh, hi there. You might be wondering why am I in a legitimate video about how to do something in your car? Well, it's because I need to do something with my car, and we had the fortune of having Prestone reach out and say they want me to do something to my car. Awesome collaboration. In this case, I'm going to be taking my generic .3 brake fluid and replacing it with higher quality Prestone .4. Not only is it, brand name versus a generic off-the-shelf stuff that I like to use to save money, but it's also different dot numbers. Now, for the average person, .3, .4 doesn't really mean much, but to the car enthusiasts, and particularly to the autocross enthusiasts, that makes a world of difference. So those of you that watched my dyno video, the very first comment that was on there, other than somebody saying first, was, look at his stock brakes. Mind you, this is not an autocross car, but the stock brakes are very proficient. They work well until you start getting them very hot. Well, my life is heating up very quickly, and it's time for me to use higher quality brake fluid. So just simply by the designation .3 to .4, this has a higher boiling point. What does that mean? That means that it's not going to cavitate and cause bubbles and lose brake pressure. I'm sure very few of you have experienced this, but when you are on autocross, you're going to experience a thing called brake fade, which is you're constantly braking, it's getting hotter and hotter to the point where the brakes become less efficient. It's terrifying. In this case, at least the one thing that matters most, the connection between your foot and each of the individual brake pads, is no longer as much of a factor. Step one, gotta get that tire off. So what I'm doing right now, a little different than I normally do, is I'm actually jacking the car up from the rear, but I'm touching what I have is a diff cover. It's covering my differential, which allows me to put a lot of weight on it. It's connected directly to the frame. So what I'm gonna do is jack it up from the center and then use jack stands on each side of the car to keep it level and minimize any sort of problems. Now slide this under the car more efficiently than you would try to slide into somebody's DMs. The very first thing I want to point out that's not related to the point of this video, but you should be doing general inspections anyway, look at those little cracks in my rear rotor. That is something that this car is not leaving the garage without being replaced. We're also going to be replacing the bushings on the entire suspension, so you'll see that video coming out very soon. Another thing to note, my brake pads have seen their full life, they've done a good job. It's time to replace them. They're basically metal on this side. Instead of just simply flushing the brake fluid system and calling it a day, we're going to show you what the majority of you will be doing when you interact with this system. You're going to be replacing your brake pads. So there's a couple steps that change just a little bit, but for one, make it more interesting, and for two, change how you interact with the little bleeder valve. The very first thing you're going to want to do is release the pressure from the brake system. Brakes are generally under a very light amount of pressure, but still, they're not going to go anywhere until you start opening up the bleeder valve. You're going to notice a little bit of fluid. Oh, there we go. A little bit of fluid coming out. That's that slight amount of pressure, and it's going to take fluid from the top, which is higher up, and gravity is going to force it out of here. If you open this and leave it opened and walk away, you will have all of your fluid from the entire car on the ground, and you'll have tons of air in the system. Do not leave that open unattended. We're going to start by removing the caliper with the two 14mm bolts out here. Your suspicion might be to remove these bolts, but that would be wrong, as I've done many times in the past, because that simply controls the floating brake caliper part of it. You actually want to remove the whole caliper back here. So these are 14mm, those are 17mm. You don't need to remove these. So now that you have the brake caliper removed, you're going to see something very interesting with my car. Check this out. The caliper is so well mated with the rotor that they all move as one. Generally speaking, you're going to have some sort of positioning bolt on the rotor. In my case, in the rears of the RX-7, on my RX-7 specifically, the hub doesn't have a bolt, so the whole thing comes off at once. On older vehicles, the brake pads will have met the rotor so well that there'll be a little lip on the edge that requires some force to get around. I'm going to use a crowbar, and this is a budget sort of setup. I'm going to use the end of a crowbar on the outer surface of the rotor. Mind you, I'm doing that to show a more generic way. My rotors are trash, but you still don't want to touch the rotor surface. You want the pad to be the only thing touching the surface, so I like to go from the top. So we're going to apply a little bit of pressure to the now free brake caliper. Okay, so we'll go ahead and give it a little bit of a pop from the bottom, and hey, there we go. Nice and easy. So the first thing you're going to notice is my brake pads are just going to fall out. They're trash. And sure enough, even the center line's gone. This one seriously needed to be replaced. Here's the neat part. You're doing two things at once. While you're pulling the brake caliper apart and getting the brake pads to spread, you're causing fluid to leave the system under pressure. That's technically the beginning steps of bleeding the system anyway, but with this much fluid already out of the car, let's go take a look at the master cylinder, give it some new fluid, and start the process. It's very important that you keep the tip of your bleeder line submerged in fluid, because there's sometimes pressure, there's sometimes a vacuum, but there will never be air in your line. Before you get hot and heavy into this, you have to find your master cylinder. This is, on cars like this, it's both your brakes and also used for your clutch. Make sure that the thing's full of fluid. If it's empty, you're only going to make it worse by having the rest of the fluid go through the lines and introduce air into the whole system. So your goal is to make sure this always stays full. The general rule of thumb is empty it out to a third, maybe a quarter of the way left, and then start introducing new fluid. But regardless, however you want to do it, do not let this get empty and allow air to get into the brake lines. The next step is to hook this hose up to your now hand tightened, loose but hand tightened valve. Oh yeah, you like that? Oh, just fit it on there. Just, no baby. It's in. So as you can see, we already went pretty far down, which is a little bit further than I was anticipating to go, but I'm showing you the real world situation here. That's how quickly this thing empties. But if you're flushing the system, here's my personal recommendation. You can do it tons of different ways, but hear me out. We're gonna take our previous fluid. It's clean, it's good, and we're gonna continue to run the system, flush it with this in there. So we'll fill it back up. We'll leave it open. That way we get clean old fluid in there. Continue to mix those two together, the bad and the new. Get the system emptied again to ready us for our baby new DOT4 fluid. So this is what used, abused brake fluid looks like. There's sediment in there, it's cloudy, there's nastiness, and above all, it's not good. So there we have it. We have the very first take out of the system, and it's got a nice aroma of maybe a 93. It's got some metal aftertones. Overall pretty hearty. What's really interesting, when we just let it leak, it was a relatively clear fluid with chunks in it. When we start pressing the brakes and pressurizing the system, it kind of mixed it all together into this ugly color. We just put more fluid back into the master cylinder, and again, because I have extra fluid, that's part of the reason I'm doing it this way, we're gonna flush good fluid through the system. Mind you, that is only going through the brake lines and hard and soft lines to this rotor, to this caliper. The other three wheels still have the old or bad, nasty fluid still in them. So keep that in mind, is that you do this one, you're worrying about the master cylinder, but when you go to do the other ones, you're gonna have a much easier time, but you still have to bleed them all the way from the very cylinder or the ABS unit all the way back to the wheel. So we're gonna go back to that caliper and loosen it and have Jarrett watch this while I drain the rest of the fluid. Fortunately, we have a couple of these because I am not efficient and I'm sure I'll end up draining too much of the good stuff. But we're gonna begin filling this up because we're almost empty. We're gonna fill it up with DOT4 fluid. Filling up that master cylinder used about half of what's in here. And so you could use just this much, but because we're gonna do the three other wheels, I wouldn't chance it, I'd get a little bit more. And that's not product placement, that's literally just saying, realistically, you don't wanna be halfway through this and not have fluid. Filling it again, overfilling it to the top, in my case, because I'm gonna continue draining the rest of the system. let's go ahead and take a look at our second batch of used fluid to see if it's any better. This is our round 2 of flushing the system. A lot more chunks in the first one, for sure. What's really important about this is we decided to do one last little check to see how the fluid was looking, and we found while the color was looking great, there were still small things found in the fluid. So we're gonna do one last full step of flushing the whole system. So there we go, that's the result of a properly flushed brake fluid system. And special thanks to Prestone for sending us this fluid. Every fluid is made by a company, and I personally prefer using this. It's coincidental that they sent me it. But if you want to find it, you can find it in normal AutoZone and places like that. But you can also get it in the link below on Amazon and have it shipped to your door. So whatever works for you. If you are autocrossing or doing anything where you're going to be putting a lot of pressure on your brake system for extended periods of time, I would certainly consider switching to DOT4 fluid.